Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Isabel. It struck me during Alisa's wonderful talk before coffee that perhaps by design or maybe coincidence, both of us presenting keynotes this morning are diasporic citizens from the Global South, living and working in both the Global North and the Global South, but based in the Global North. And indeed, as you saw and heard from Isabel, even in academic terms, I have multiple identities. And that is perhaps, as much as anything, one of the characteristic hallmarks of the contemporary era, and indeed the subject of Alisa's talk about migrants and diasporas is precisely focused around the question of whether they are, if you like, members, or if you prefer, citizens of two worlds, or as some might see it, none. And we heard about that in all its nuances. But the concluding comment to the final question that Alisa gave sets me up nicely for a broader rethinking and re-evaluation of where we are today in relation to the topic of this conference of rethinking development. And partly because of the work that we do at Mistra Urban Futures here in Gothenburg and in the city platforms in several cities in both Global North and Global South, working as partnerships between academic and non-academic, or if you prefer, policy and practitioner and civil society and private sector organizations. The focus here is not just on development as such or development research, but the relationships, the intimate relationships, as they need to be, between theory, policy, and practice that encapsulates what we do, however we do it, within development research. The timing of the theme for this conference is particularly apposite, because perhaps more than anything else over the last number of years, pretty well everybody I encounter, north, south, east, or west, feels that we are at a time of unprecedented uncertainty, anxiety. The zeitgeist is one of angst, if you prefer. And in a lot of the literature, particularly the critical literature, this is posed as a question of crisis. Some people prefer to think of it as a global systemic crisis of capitalism or capitalist-dominated relationships. Other people characterize it as a set of related or nested or cascading crises. And I'm not sure it needs to be either or. I think it can be both and. But what are its key characteristics? It's infected, it's infectious, and it challenges quite profoundly pretty well everything that we as individuals, whatever our background, our socialization, formal education, or indeed none, and professional practice, with a sense that what is to follow will not look quite like what is, and even what is looks remarkably unlike what was, to quite a large extent. We have a multipolar world where the poles are still redefining themselves. Regional, global superpowers engaging in conflicts directly, trade wars, rhetoric wars, international global governance wars, using multiple proxies in military and non-military conflicts, and infecting, if you like, pretty well every aspect of what we think of as the fabric of our lives. On the one hand, globalization increases apace. Some people have even claimed it is complete, which I don't believe. But equally importantly, and largely in reaction to that, are various strands of anti-globalization. And that, in a sense, is part of the anchor for my remarks this morning. We can look at these in terms of a whole range of headings, as I've got in the bullet points, about the nature of the predominantly capitalist economic relations, socio-cultural realm, the environmental sphere, direct political and governance agendas, and for the purposes of today, a focus on development. And actually, I think all of that, but picking up development as today a truly global concern and agenda as embedded in Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals as being for all countries, no longer just low-income and middle-income countries as with the Millennium Development Goals and multiple agendas that preceded those, provide us with a helpful lens to think critically about some of the headlines of today's angst. Trump, Brexit, xenophobia, we heard some of that already. Post-truth. Just a couple of days ago, the former mayor of New York and key aide and legal advisor to Trump was arguing without so much as a blush that truth is not truth. Or perhaps put slightly more relationally, as we might see it in development discourse, your truth is not necessarily my truth. And that picks up many of the debates within development discourse that I will look at. But I think it's also important to recognize that we have been here before, at least in development terms. Because the 1980s, the onset of the debt crisis, the demise of state socialism as a potentially viable alternative to capitalist-led development as modernization, the widening gap between rich and poor, yeah, we've had it before. Or maybe we're still in the same place with widening disparities. The advent of what became the environmental crises of pollution, of transboundary effects, the growing challenge to traditional national sovereignty of the sort of Westphalian state system of different forms of regional and global governance, climate change regimes, trade regimes, regional trading blocs, you name it, all of which have assumed powers that the purists and many of today's anti-globalization advocates from populist or neo-populist perspectives want to restore as if going back to some nostalgia for a lost age in the past. But also importantly, the growing differentiation within that hitherto kind of lumpen proletariat of the global system, the third world, which has ceased to have any particular coherence as an intellectual analytical term other than in terms of the historical legacy that gave rise to it, but which has long since been splintered. And in intellectual terms and theoretical terms, the rise in the 1970s and 80s of postmodernism as a critique, a very profound critique of all the development theories and the ways of arguing, or if you like, epistemologies of modernism that preceded it. And it's really interesting to go back and to look at some of the key texts of that period, and particularly the book edited by Franz Schürmann, published in 1993, Beyond the Impasse, which was really the first sustained attempt to think about how we might move forward when faced with what seemed like an overwhelming multiplicity of insuperable challenges to the idea of a coherent theoretical approach that might explain all of those things and a lot more. And so in that context, it's worth reminding ourselves, perhaps, why we're here. What is it that we do in intellectual inquiry and in our practice within what we might loosely call development studies? Michael Edwards, one of the key thinkers of the 1990s and 2000s who transgressed the boundaries between academia, the NGO world, theory, policy, and practice, published a memorable little piece where he defined it in the terms of the 2 bullet points on your screen. The objective of promoting the development of people denied access to knowledge, resources, and power. And he felt that this was best achieved by formulating and applying theory and practice in a single people-centered process. So 2 key take-home points there, that theory and practice are intimately linked and articulating, and that this all needs to be centered on people. And how often don't we have to remind ourselves, wherever we work, whatever we work on, whether it is theoretical, whether it is empirical, whether it is methodologically, that the real people in whose name we do all that we do so often get marginalized, so often get left out of the picture almost entirely. This, he said, was the real task for development theories. Paraphrasing gently, we might therefore say that development theories that stay in the lecture room or stay in our offices or in our laptops and in academic debate are not really doing their job. Because the role of theory is to represent reality and have an element of dynamism, a theory of change, if you prefer, which is all about changing those realities that exist today. And we do well to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of my talk. And I pulled together just a sample of some of the key books, never mind the tens of thousands of articles, blogs, grey literature, that have attempted to address these challenges in different ways. And I dare say from somewhat different perspectives. But all of the ones on the screen are broadly progressive or radical, critical, if you like, in epistemological, in theoretical terms, challenging the existing problems of development as perceived and understood in their own respective ways. And there is no sign that the flood of books is abating. The challenge remains as profound, which on the one hand is deeply worrying. On the other hand, I take encouragement from it that so many people, including all of us in this room and many who are not, are still concerned and engaged with these challenges and ultimately seeking, in whatever sense, to help to make the world a better place. Or to go back to Michael Edwards and many other people's challenges, to promote the challenges of empowering the powerless. So not doing development for the subjects or the recipients of development as modernist theory and practice over decades sought to do, often for the best of reasons, but often with misguided approaches and unfortunate consequences, but actually to assist the empowerment, or in plain English, to help the powerless to help themselves. So ultimately, if we're successful in that enterprise, we should make ourselves redundant in the process. The logical consequence of successful development assistance, he says, looking carefully at the representatives from SIDA and the Vetenskapsrådet, the Swedish Research Council and others, is that there is in future, at some point, no further need for such official development assistance or NGO assistance. But I suspect we're as far from that as we ever have been. Equally, the sustainability crisis, the understanding of the world as not people and natural resources somehow separated from nature, but part of nature, a holistic, alternative way of seeing and understanding the world, is generating at least as great a sphere of endeavor. And I've chosen a series of titles there, again from heterodox perspectives, that seek to integrate the environment with development in different ways. Some of them broadly within existing relations of production and power relations in the global system, and many challenging them directly. And on the right, the latest book published quite recently by Arturo Escobar encapsulates the way in which these post-development concerns engage with multiple senses of reality, multiple approaches to the world. And if you're wondering what the hell pluriverse is, it's the opposite of universe. So intellectually and in terms of policy and his understandings of the Afro-Colombian communities where he does most of his empirical work, it's the idea of multiple realities, of multiple locally centered universes, hence pluriverse, that is what should be sought. Let's think over the last 25 years since the development dictionary, that sort of beacon of post-development, was published. And where are we today in relation to development policy and practice compared to the 1980s? I would argue, and many no doubt would disagree with the balance or perhaps even the key points here, that we have achieved greater fluidity, a more plural approach, and a greater concern with appropriateness. We are very much post-impasse, not just in chronological senses of time, but actually in many aspects of how we work and how we think about development challenges. Some people are very much working in post-structural approaches. Others still wedded to the conventional ideas of modernization theory and its multiple applications within the existing state system of interstate relations. But even within the UN, the struggle for change has yielded some results. Not enough, and they will continue. But the power geometries, the way in which membership of the Security Council, membership of several of the specialist committees, and crucially of some of the key development agencies, is rather different today from how it was, say, when Kofi Annan, as Secretary General, started the process of change, slow and incremental within that rather rigid organization. And it's timely to mention him because, of course, as many of you know, he actually passed away last weekend at the age of 80, still traveling the world and trying to achieve what he left unfinished when he handed over as UN Secretary General. On the other hand, we have to recognize that the international financial institutions, and indeed many bilateral agencies, often forget what, to paraphrase the slogan of the World Bank in the 1970s and early 80s of learning by doing, what they themselves have learnt by doing. There are many reasons for that. It's not deliberate, it's not a conspiracy. The same thing is true in universities, large private companies, and all sorts of other institutions. The loss of institutional memory with staff turnover, generational successions. And the result is that policies tend to be cyclical. And if you shut your eyes and change the date, you sometimes can be forgiven for thinking you're reading a document of 25 or 30 years ago rather than of today. Part of the challenge is about the ways in which we operate. Increasing obsession with accountability and transparency, the practice of which creates very heavy bureaucratization and rigidities, displacements, and perversely kills, wipes out, deletes the innovative, progressive, sometimes radical impulses which were the origin of many of those elements of the development impasse, for example, in the late 70s and 1980s. We still haven't worked out that when some radical idea, basic needs, gender relations, poverty eradication, start as something different and challenging to the status quo, they're accepted as important and gain legitimacy, and then become embodied in the official practices of large institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the bilateral agencies. That process of mainstreaming, which is the objective of introducing change in the first place, paradoxically becomes the source of rigidity, of ossification, the rough edges, if you like, the radical components, the challenges to the status quo get knocked off or polished off in the process of institutionalization. We're still very little further forward in addressing that fundamental paradox than we were. But there have been quite substantial balance changes between multilateral and bilateral official development assistance. I regret that the pendulum seems to have swung somewhat further back towards bilateral relationships with all the challenges of conditionalities and procurement restrictions that we thought in the aid debates of the late 70s and early 80s, we'd won and moved beyond. We seem again to be going back. But there is now a different and much more global and integrated global approach than we had in the past. And they're encapsulated, some would say for better, others would say perhaps it's simply a fig leaf of convenience, in Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They're important. We work a lot with them, and I do believe that they have quite important potential, often not in the ways you might expect, to influence and to drive change, particularly where you have stakeholder engagement and prodding from below. But they are limited in being voluntary. The targets remain somewhat arbitrary, but they do reflect a holistic approach to sustainable development on a global basis in a way that we haven't actually had before, not even in Rio or since Rio until Agenda 2030. Some people therefore proudly proclaim that we're in a new era, but others say this is just the latest, slightly more euphemistic or softened form of global capitalist modernization as development. Aram Ziai, who is sitting here and with us today, published a very provocative book 2 years ago, arguing in great detail on those very agenda items. And at this point, it might just be worth very briefly reminding ourselves of what I see as important differences between anti-development and post-development in the theoretical discourse, which were at the time often conflated. So, to give you one example, the Development Dictionary that everybody knows, edited by Wolfgang Sachs, Arturo Escobar's book, Encountering Development, the Rise and Fall of the Third World, were portrayed as the beacons, the cornerstones of post-development. But if you actually look in detail at what they contained, they were actually beacons of anti-development. They were challenges to, critiques of, dismissals of the validity, the benefits of conventional modernization as development. But what they fell short of doing was posing alternatives, i.e., so what? Where do we go from here? That is what I characterize as post-development. And indeed, if you look at the second edition of Encountering Development, published 3 or 4 years ago, there is now substantial coverage of Escobar's revisionings for the future. And many of the people who were in the anti-development camp then are now more properly, if you like, articulating ideas of post-development. That whole approach of pluriverse, of hybridity, of syncretic blends, if you like, of the indigenous or the traditional and the modern, different technologies, different worldviews, which I'll come to in a moment, are some of the characteristics of post-structural discourse and engagement today. Just before I get on to that, in the rather wonderful review that Aram edited in Third World Quarterly at the end of last year, the Development Dictionary at 25, there is a fascinating conversation between Arturo Escobar and Gustavo Esteva, two of the icons of the field, and it's constructed as a sort of retrospect prospect. And in one of his segments of the text, Esteva quotes Salvatore Babones as classifying the current development panorama as follows. And he associates it with the 3 Sachses. The Goldman Sachs approach expresses a pretty general consensus that dominates in governments and international institutions. It defines development through their commodity trading desks, their infrastructural projects, and their exploration units. It means an oil platform located 10 kilometers offshore, safe from harassment by local indigenous militants. Second, the Jeffrey Sachs approach blindly believes in development and capitalism, but is concerned with massive hunger and misery, which they see not as a consequence, but insufficiencies of both. Well-meaning people like Sachs, Gates, and major US and European NGOs focus on the alleviation of obvious suffering. They stand for what he characterizes as a chicken in every pot, a mosquito net over every bed, and a condom on every penis. And thirdly, the Wolfgang Sachs approach circulates in critical development studies circles and departments and among indigenous leaders, independent intellectuals, and a motley group of people basically ignored by academia and the 1%. In his view, this approach corresponds today to the awareness and experience, not necessarily the discourse, of millions, perhaps billions, of ordinary men and women around the world who are increasingly beyond development. Now, it's partly tongue-in-cheek, but there's a lot there, and ultimately the challenge that we all face today, whatever our ideological or theoretical perspectives and how we translate those into practice, is in a sense how we mediate, how we move across, how we try to reconcile those three rather challengingly different, perhaps even contradictory perceptions and understandings. Because I know lots of people, not just the named individuals, but lots of people all over the world who adhere to those different positions. But rather more hopefully, I also know lots of people, myself included, who feel empathy with elements of all three of those positions. Is that not hybridity and syncretic approach? Or is it just straight contradiction and eclectic wishful thinking? I went back while preparing for this talk and looking through the different books to take the photographs on the previous slide, and I found myself engaging again with a book which struck me at the time as hugely significant. And even 24, whatever, years later, it puzzles me how little recognition it got, and it appears to have been almost totally forgotten. And maybe the reason for that, in those rather polemically charged debates around anti and post-development, his problem, if you like, was that he didn't use the appropriate language, the appropriate terminology. But actually, even now, Bob Norgaard's approach seems to me to encapsulate very eloquently and without the burden of upfront ideology and the associated complex vocabularies, much of what today remains at the forefront of how we need to be rethinking development, research, policy, and practice. So let me spend a couple of minutes just going through some of the key elements. And the book was called provocatively Development Betrayed. And he expressed that betrayal in terms of three key components, which are up there on the screen. The issue of disparities in wealth of income, that resource depletion and environmental degradation endanger many and threaten the hopes of all to come, was how he put it. He talked about the public sectors of states with ideologies of whatever sort being powerless, facing actual collapse or at least a loss of ability to fulfill both traditional and new roles and challenges. And even then, he detected that people increasingly were declaring that the culture of modernism was dead. He had a holistic approach, which we might recognize, although it may not have been associated with him. It's also the way in which many of us working on sustainability think about the integration between our values, the knowledge that we generate in the light of those values, the uses and abuses of the environment, the way in which changing technologies enable us to do different things and contribute both positively and negative to resource use, exploitation, conservation, and degradation. And the way in which, in a sense, through different forms of organization at every scale from the household to the global, all of these others are tied together. So that is a kind of holistic, or as he called it, co-evolutionary frame within which he argued for the need for a co-evolutionary approach or cosmology. And again, having recently reread this, I'm struck by the depth of the similarities between that and the kind of approach that, say, Arturo Escobar is now articulating in towards the pluriverse, and a new project that he's just beginning that he and I and several others were debating earlier this year at the Association of American Geographers. So I'm not going to read them out. You can read them a lot faster. But essentially the idea is that how we understand the world, the cosmos, determines how we affect, how we act, how we influence the system. He argues the need for conceptual pluralism, to get away from that idea of modernist discourse that there is one truth. My theory is the best. This is the Bible. My Bible is your Bible. He emphasizes the collectivity, that people are parts of societies or collectives or groups of different sorts, and therefore that social knowledge is crucial. And yet, in this age of individualized liberalism or neoliberalism and individual liberties that we valorize so much in much of the West, it is that collectivity that often gets lost. And commuting literally and figuratively as I do between the UK and Sweden, even just the short expanse of the North Sea marks a huge difference in terms of the way in which these issues are understood and inform life in Sweden and the other Nordic countries compared with the UK or France, Germany, and elsewhere. So it's not a global south, global north thing. There are multiple ways of doing this according to various forms of predominantly capitalist, social democratic welfare state. But yet individuals exist within and influence individually the state and the cosmos. We can't ignore the past and the ways in which that determines and influences who and what we are and how we act today. And he reminds us of the importance of contextuality, the relative positions of things. So where is post-development today? And I've covered quite a lot of this already. I think anti-development has more or less been eclipsed by different forms and understandings of post-development. There are today many different local cosmologies, many of them holistic, many of them hybrid, many of them engaging to different extents and in different ways with elements of modernity, not a total rejection, not the sort of autarky that was once articulated by Andre Gunther Frank and others of the only way to develop and escape the unequal exchange relations of global capitalism is to cut yourself off. There are very few communities, even those fighting globalization, wanting something other than capitalist modernity, who recognize the importance of certain resources, certain material goods and services, the importance of certain forms of medicine, for example. So we move then increasingly towards pluriversal understandings of the world rather than a single global or universal understanding. Many people in post-development dismiss mainstream sustainable development as an oxymoron. There is still much resource plunder and environmental and social harm in the name of development. And I'm sure we can all think of current examples that occupy headlines, albeit rather fleetingly. Attempts to implement some form of post-development, or what we might understand as that, most readily done at the local, perhaps at the regional scale, is when we scale up that we have profound challenges. But importantly, there is no one animal called post-development. It is also a broad umbrella for multiple different forms of interpretation and implementation. And these are not immune from the subjectivities and the internal challenges and inconsistencies that we all ultimately embody. There are many ongoing challenges to which, again, as I said earlier, there are no easy solutions, but I think we are a little bit further forward than we were at the time of the impasse. Within a lot of the post-development literature, and despite that sort of heritage of post-structural argumentation and post-modern approaches, many of the visions still tend to be quite simplistic and, ironically, universalizing. Sample size 1, this community, this area. If that were true at a world scale, you can fill in the rest. There is still a tendency to idealize traditional or indigenous societies and perhaps to regard them as having greater validity perhaps than Western, external, international processes, technologies, and so on. There is still a tendency to think of them as somehow static, not as dynamic, fluid, changing, and internally contradictory as any other society. the essays in the special issue that Aram edited of Third World Quarterly at the end of last year also struggles with the challenges that many post-development thinkers still have in addressing effectively internal hierarchies within indigenous societies and communities, and power relations, both internal and at larger scales. There's still a tendency to dismiss those as simply the, as I've got it there on the screen, a function of colonized minds. So if we can only decolonize our minds, that problem will go away. Well, as Sally Matthews argues very convincingly in a paper using evidence from South Africa, that is actually, and I've argued the same in the past, rather demeaning. It's anti-democratic. It's also hypocritical. And in, I think, one of the most fascinating papers in that collection, Ilan Kapoor tries to understand this basic issue by looking at the power of what he calls libidinal attachments, our liking for material goods and services of one sort or another, be it the cappuccino on the Piazza Cafe or anything more substantive, and sees the problem as being the strong attachment to the Foucauldian approach of deconstruction and concern with governmentality, which omits the attention to power relations and the hankering, i.e. wants, not needs, of many material goods. And that he sees as a key weakness of post-development in challenging global capitalism. So, enough of theory. Let me finish the last few minutes by drawing in part on the work that we do in Mistra Urban Futures in an urban context, but applying it more generally to the challenges of research and trying to cross over and address some of these intellectual questions and challenges in a practical way. Tools for the job. Well, from that theoretical discussion, it's clear that we need something that is epistemologically coherent. We need rigor. But in contrast to many of the traditional research tools, we also need flexibility so we can address and cope with these inconsistencies, perhaps contradictions, the hybridities of processes and forms. And we need to avoid the temptation to universalize, to say, well, if everywhere behaved like this, or if everywhere were like here, then ... Because one thing we should have learned by now is that other places are not like here. And they are not necessarily like us in terms of how they think, work, want, although, of course, globalization means that there are many elements of similarity. So what sorts of methodologies are appropriate to this then? I would argue that they need to be transdisciplinary, which I'll define in a minute, and inclusive. And hence, elements of co-design or co-production, as they're often called, and other forms of meaningful or substantive participation hold the key in terms of trying to embrace this diversity and the challenge, which we all know about even from university committee meetings or departmental committee meetings, of contrasting and conflicting views and challenges. So you could go for a majority vote, but ultimately, if you're going to move forward, there are now a range of methodologies that are quite helpful in trying to transcend those often intractable differences. But again, in keeping with what I've been saying, we increasingly need a multi-methods approach, a suite of different tools, and shouldn't expect to rely just on one. And every time I examine a PhD thesis, which is quite frequently, I'm struck by the methodology chap to the student saying, I've used a multi-methods approach as if this was somehow novel or something that needed to be defended. It is de rigueur, and it should be the norm. And the worrying thing is that we don't all seem to be there quite yet. Part of the challenge. By transdisciplinary research, I mean a deep and extended form of participatory work, but crucially involving partners from academic and non-academic roles, circuits of life, institutions, as well as practitioners, policymakers, civil society, private sector perhaps, in different combinations. And the idea is that representatives of those different stakeholders work together at all stages of the research process, from even agreeing, as it were, what is a problem, or what is the problem that we wish to address, to designing an approach, the methodology to tackle it, undertaking the research, undertaking the analysis jointly, and then if the statutory responsibility for implementation, as often is the case, falls into one or other of those stakeholders, then supporting that institution to do it. And I would argue that those are key ingredients for success. But why do we need this co-design and co-production? Well, it's summarized there. It enables us to address the new challenges that confront us every day, or at least new configurations of long-standing challenges in development. And by development, I again categorically do not mean out there in the global south for poor and low middle-income countries and communities. I mean what we're all engaged in. And to me, one of the crucial semantic shifts about the SDGs is the understanding that many people in the North still haven't appreciated, that we all have work to do, even in Norway, Iceland, Sweden, Denmark, Japan, the countries at the top of the Human Development Index, the countries that are closest in many senses to fulfilling it, many, but not all, of the SDGs. So in a sense, we're all developing, and we all have development research, policy, and practice to do as part of our daily lives and our professional engagements. The work we do in urban areas is key, but we're beset by issues of political administrative boundaries, resourcing. Does co-production require local authority engagement and leadership, or are residents increasingly being left in a post-development sense to their own devices? That transformatory potential, I argue, is still largely unexplored, but very necessary. But the key challenge here, which is ultimately the challenge of sustainable development writ large, is how we all overcome the inherent short-termism of institutional routines and practices. The annual planning round, the 2 or 3 year budget cycle, the 5-year plan, the electoral cycle. I don't know of any of those anywhere that has a life of more than 6 or 7 years in certain presidential systems. But most institutional planning systems operate on a 3, perhaps 4-year cycle. And yet, in order to achieve sustainability, we need that medium to long-term perspective. And therefore, the challenge is, how do we convince our leaders, how do we as engaged citizens and development researchers set within those institutional constraints the ball rolling in a way that will survive the next planning round, the next election? And that is a challenge to which there is no simple answer, but with co-production, where local authorities, regional authorities, the other key stakeholders who drive those processes are engaged, we have a chance of transcending the political party divide, the stakeholder structural oppositions that we've all been struggling with for so long. And it's ultimately that, I would argue, that holds the key to moving forward in a way that enables us to engage meaningful with all those different worldviews, cosmologies, and ultimately to empower people to help themselves. And in that way, I would argue, as post-development practice, to help to make the world a better place. Thank you very much.